Hey, this is Steve Magnanti, also known as Steve Maggs, and I'm the host of the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show. On this episode, we're going to be strip mining my book, Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts. Now, the book itself is broken down into chapters about GM, Ford, Chrysler, and AMC and Studebaker. And we're going to start the book here, reading in order from number 1 onward. And of course, number 1, the first chapter, is about Chevrolet products, legend and lore. But fear not, while we're going to talk about Camaros, Z28s, Novas, and Corvettes in this episode, there's still going to be a lot of stuff from Mopar and Ford guys. We're going to be talking about Boss 302s, Boss 429s, Race Hemis, even 446-pack Roadrunner that makes an appearance in a 1970 movie. It's all right now on the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show. Okay, as we begin, we're going to start with fact number 1. You got to remember, when I wrote this book, it was about 9 months of effort. And, ladies out there, you know that you can have a baby in 9 months' time. And having this book, or writing this book, was kind of like having a baby. Not that I'll ever know what that's really like. But as I sat down there with number 1, I knew full well that I had 1,000 more facts ahead of me to write. So what I kind of did was kind of threw a dart at the wall of Chevrolet history and got started with number 1. Here it is. Okay, legend and lore, Chevrolet, fact number 1. Chevrolet's 1967 response to the Mustang phenomena was initially called Panther, and several pre-production test cars bore elegant chromed Panther emblems to prove it. Apparently, Chevrolet product planners felt that sleek four-legged creatures were a valid counterpart to the wild horse theme embraced by Ford's Mustang. Ultimately, the Camaro nameplate was chosen, but not until after Car Life magazine ran a March 1966 cover story with the blooper headline reading, "Chevrolet's Panther, Can It Catch a Mustang?" Camaro is an obscure French term that translates into comrade, pal, or chum. Now, I can't show you it here, but that Car Life magazine, indeed, right there on the cover, was the word Panther. So no doubt about it, the Chevy product planners probably said, hey, Mustang running horse, Panther running cat, we got to get close but not copy. Let's go with Panther. At the very last minute, somebody came up and said, no, Panther's not working for us. Let's make it Camaro. And of course, Camaro history has proven that it was not a bad idea. But again, that's the first fact. Let's go on to number 2. And in no particular logical reason, this one's a little different. Here we go. The 1970 Robert Altman movie, Brewster McCloud, features a great car chase involving a 1970 446-barrel Roadrunner and a black-on-silver 70 Camaro Z28 RS. The Camaro is driven by Detective Frank Shaft, played by Michael Murphy. Sharp-eyed viewers will notice that 2 different Camaros were used during filming. After a violent curb shot damaged the rear suspension, standard Z28 with a non-RS full-width front bumper was substituted to continue the chase sequence. Now, movie cars, as we all know, in most situations, far more than one car is used. Like the Dukes of Hazzard, something like 180 cars or something like that. Chargers, 1969 and 68 and 70, by the way, Dodge Chargers were used up in making all those Dukes of Hazzard episodes. So in this movie, Brewster McCloud, which is kind of a weird movie, by the way, it's got a lot of symbolism in it. Unusual film, really. But again, it was made in 1971, and with a 446-pack Roadrunner. And I'm a Mopar guy at the core. And of course, this is a Chevy chapter. But with that said, in the chapter, or in the show, you can actually watch the Dana rear axle, the air grabber hood, and the pistol grip 4-speed. It's almost like a Plymouth advertisement. But beyond that, the detective, of course, his name was Frank Shaft, played by Michael Murphy, was going after the Roadrunner in a 70 Camaro RS Z28. Now, of course, we know that RS stands for Rally Sport, which means that the car had the split front bumper and different parking lamps and directionals on the grille. But again, in one of the shots, you can see the car. The right rear corner smacks the curb hard. It's wearing Krager SS mags, if I remember correctly, and you actually see the wheel get bent and the car kind of hobble off into the distance. So undoubtedly, that was a cut, bring in the second car, or maybe rent the second car, who knows. But with that said, the second car they brought in was a color match Z28, but it wasn't a Rally Sport. Had the one-piece bumper. It was a whole different car. But with movie magic, they spliced it together, and they figured most people probably wouldn't notice, but we did. Okay, moving on to fact number 3. Here we go. Enthusiasts often assume the 265 cubic inch small block of 1955 was Chevrolet's first V8 offering. They ignore the existence of a 288 cubic inch V8 that was available in 1917. The Chevrolet Series D automobile, designed by staff engineer A.C. Mason, it featured overhead valves, cross-flow cylinder heads, and displacement of 288 cubic inches. Rated output was 55 horsepower at 2,700 RPM. For contrast, the same year Model T Flathead 4 was good for 20 horsepower. Still, the Model D V8 Chevys were expensive, $1,400 versus $645 for the most costly Model T, and production ended by 1919. So a lot of guys, they think, first Chevy V8, 1955. No way. 1917 through 1919, you could actually get an overhead valve Chevy V8 engine. And once again, 55 horsepower at the time was over twice, almost 3 times what the Ford 200 cubic inch Flathead 4 in a Model T was producing. So you can probably win a beer at the next guy's night out with that piece of trivia. It's fact. Chevrolet had a V8 before 1955. Okay, number 4. Zora Arkus Duntov is often given credit for fathering both the Chevrolet V8 engine and the Corvette. He did neither. Joining Chevrolet as a research and development engineer in May of 1953, the Corvette was already in production, and the collaboration between Ed Cole and Harry Barr that led to the small block V8 was well underway. That said, Duntov helped sharpen both programs in the months and years to follow. Retirement. His GM mandated retirement on September 29, 1974 at age 65. Duntov was responsible for keeping the Corvette true to its roots as a serious sports car by defeating numerous corporate efforts to water it down for greater but likely fleeting market appeal. So it's true, Duntov went down in history as a legend in the world of Chevrolet performance, but he did not invent the small block or the Corvette. But again, he paid a lot of attention to both programs and made sure they stayed true to their roots. Okay, fact number 5. Instead of ringing in the new year at a fancy party, Fred Gibb, proprietor of Fred Gibb Chevrolet in La Harpe, Illinois, spent New Year's Eve 1969 standing outdoors in sub-freezing weather. The first of his 30-car order for 1969 ZL1 Camaros was en route from Chevrolet, and he wanted to be personally present to oversee the unloading process. After all, the group of 30 specially ordered aluminum block Copo 9560 Camaros cost him $216,000, not including tax. At $7,200 each, Gibbs struggled to sell 13 ZL1 Camaros before Chevrolet came to the rescue and helped disperse the remaining unsold units to other dealers. Of course, this fact refers to the 1969 ZL1 427 program. Of course, that was a Reynolds aluminum engine block, which cut the weight of that 427 down to nearly that of a small block 350. But it still had the power of a 427. And again, Chevrolet made 69 Camaros with the ZL1 engine, and Fred Gibb, in a tremendous act of patriotism to the GM brand, ordered 30 cars. And, he must have been freaking out. $216,000 in 1969 money was a bunch of money. And again, he only managed to sell 13 cars. And in fact, most of those cars are still present. There's a ZL1 registry, and you can actually tell if your 69 Camaro ZL1 is real or not by going onto the registry. But with that said, when he realized, hey, I can't sell these, Chevrolet, probably Vince Piggins, who was a management guy at Chevrolet, said, okay, no problem, Fred, bring those cars back or send them to other dealers, which then helped him sell them. But that said, selling 13 $7,200 Camaros with aluminum 427s was quite a feat in 1969. Okay, moving on to number 6 in the first chapter, Chevrolet Legend and Lore. The company logo for Jenkins Competition incorporates the outline of a black arrow. Ever wonder why? Well, as a child growing up in rural Pennsylvania, Doug Grump, as Bill Jenkins was often called, enjoyed building and sailing Comet flat-bottom sailboats, one of which he named the Black Arrow. The only Jenkins race car to actually bear the Black Arrow name was his 1965 Plymouth A990 Hemi Superstocker. Bill's subsequent Chevrolet drag machines carried the Grumpy's toy moniker. Now, getting back a little bit here, the term Comet was a manufacturer of balsa and wooden toys boats, little boats for children to play with, sailboats that actually had sails and rigging, and you'd build as a kid and put it on a pond and sail it like a miniature square rigger or whaling ship, if you will. But again, Jenkins named his pet boat as a kid the Black Arrow, And again, that name appeared on his 65 Plymouth. Yes, Plymouth. Now, a lot of guys associate Bill the Grump Jenkins with Chevrolet, which he made most of his career wins with. But in 65, yeah, Bill Jenkins actually ran a Plymouth Hemi car and helped Dave Strickler in his career with Hemi-powered vehicles. In 1966, of course, the Street Hemi came out. Jenkins did talk to Chrysler about getting a Hemi car. Somehow it didn't come to happen. And instead, Jenkins ran an L79 327 350 Nova, which really ran hard and made life really hard for guys like J.R. Stahl, who ran street Hemis in '66. So Bill Jenkins' Black Arrow was the nickname of his little boat from his childhood. It makes me think of Rosebud in the movie Citizen Kane. Rosebud, Rosebud. So Jenkins, funny thing is, by the way, I bought Bill Jenkins a beer. Probably about 1999 or 2000. I was at the PRI show in Indianapolis, and there's Bill Jenkins behind me. I'm getting a beer. It's lunchtime, and I said, Bill, I'm going to buy you a beer. He goes, yep, okay. And I gave him this beer, and that was it. Didn't want to chat, nothing like that, but I can say that I bought Bill Jenkins a beer. So moving on to fact number 6. Here we go. The company logo. Oops, sorry. Okay, moving on to that was 6. Let's do 7. Okay, moving on. Okay. Fact number 7, Chevrolet legend and lore. There's plenty of fact, number 7. There's plenty of fact behind rumors of the semi-Hemi Z28 head program. In June of 1968, Z28 development engineers got a look at Ford's canted valve Boss 302 cylinder heads and contracted a sudden case of insecurity. Product performance group leader Vince Piggins sensed that the small block's inline valve orientation and Siamese port runners might impart a flow disadvantage. A hasty development program netted several sets of aluminum heads with canted valves and non-Siamese port runners. The heads gained peak power in testing, but sacrificed valuable mid-range torque. Though paperwork was prepared to introduce the so-called bolt-on head package to the SCCA, the standard Z28 heads were competing successfully against Ford, so the program was canceled in July, early 1969. At least 3 sets of semi-Hemi 302 engines were built for testing. In fact, so, while most people think Hemi, they think 426 Chrysler or, the Boss 429 Ford, there's no doubt that Chevrolet was touring with Hemi engines too, and not just small blocks. In fact, I believe 1968 Hot Rod magazine had a full cover feature about Chevrolet's mustache twirlers, they called them, and they basically showed Chevy big blocks and small blocks with Hemi heads. So, General Motors, of course, in 1963, had a self-imposed racing ban. There was a whole thing where they were facing antitrust legislation. So in March of '63, the management said, look, no more high-profile racing, get out of racing. And that killed the Super Duty Pontiac 421s, the Z11 409/427 Impala program. That stuff was dead. Grand Sport Corvettes, all that stuff dead in '63. But what could have happened, man, would have made Chrysler and Ford's efforts look pretty puny, because General Motors, they come in with all the horses charging, and they can pretty much zonk anyone they want to with the money they have. But with that said, those 302 Z28s came out with standard Chevy type heads, big 202, 164 valves, but the Hemi heads that could have happened didn't materialize, at least in production. But Smokey Yunick, that fellow down in Florida, that rule bender, absolutely got a hold of some of those semi-Hemis, and when he had his auctions back in the 1990s, I guess, some of those Hemi head 302s materialized, and they exist to this day. But man, wouldn't that be crazy to buy a new Z28 with the cylinder head bolt-on package, pop that hood and see a couple of wide valve covers and semi-Hemi cylinder heads? But as it turned out, the standard Chevy port and valve locations were certainly good enough to take care of the Boss 302. And speaking of which, the Boss 302 was a semi-Hemi design with canted valves, kind of like the big block Chevy, if you ask me. But with that said, exotic cylinder heads don't always pull their weight on the racetrack. And again, the standard Chevy pattern worked just fine on the SCCA road race circuit. Okay, fact number 8 from Chevy Legend and Lore. Here we go. In 1957, Chevrolet had a beautiful 283 cubic inch V8 that was a hot rodder's delight. But when it was found that the displacement of this engine couldn't be enlarged to match the competition for 58, the engineers were forced to use a completely new power plant, one that had been designed originally as a power plant for heavy-duty trucks. Now that's a quote. These words were written by Hot Rod Magazine's Don Francisco in 1958 and are likely the source of incorrect assumptions about the W Series 348-409 being a truck engine. Well, if that's true, then we also have to toss the mighty 350 small block and 454 big block into the dumpster, because just as many of those engines were installed in GMC and Chevy pickup trucks as in passenger cars. The W Series 348 409 was designed to be very flexible and well suited for work or fun, depending on the state of tune. Now that's the thing. A lot of guys say, oh, that 348, that 409, they're truck engines. Well, again, Don Francisco, writing in that 1958 edition of Hot Rod magazine, was a little off base. Not sure who told him that, but the 409 and 348 were absolutely built to be pliable, to either power a station wagon or a dump truck, and he did very good work in both. The key problem with the W engine, whether it's a 348 or a 409, is the fact that they had a Heron-style cylinder head, which means no combustion chamber in the head. You pull a 348 or 409 head, it's flat. You can see the tops of the valves, but there's no chamber, no void. Instead, Chevrolet machined the top of the deck of the engine block to create a wedge-shaped combustion chamber. And what that meant was the piston had to bear the contour of the combustion chamber, which made the piston very heavy. So when you're revving that heavy piston up over 6,000 RPM, you break connecting rods. So the weakness of the 348 and the 409 was all about connecting rod strength and breaking those rods when you try to push them as a hot rodder will. But in standard use, the 348 and the 409 were very capable of hanging in there with anything else from Detroit up to about 500 horsepower. After that, you want good connecting rods. In fact, I've written a lot of magazine articles for Hot Rod and Hot Rod Deluxe and Carcraft about the 348 and the 409. And the first thing you do is you buy a set of good billet steel connecting rods to prevent the problem of breakage, because the pistons you have to use on top of those rods are pretty heavy. But with a good rod, the 348 and the 409 will last forever. Fact number 9. Though there were no 1983 Corvettes sold to the public, 43 units, 10 prototypes, and 33 pilot cars bearing 1983 VINs were assembled for testing and publicity. A lone example is on display at the National Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky. The rest are reported to have been scrapped, some having been buried at GM's former Mesa, Arizona Desert Proving Grounds, the DPG. As the defunct DPG is redeveloped for residential use, backhoe operators are likely in for many surprising discoveries. Now, when I was at Hot Rod Magazine, we had a Project Chevelle, and I was able to go out to the Desert Proving Grounds and use the Proving Grounds as sort of a test place for this Chevelle. While I was there, had nice conversations with a lot of guys who worked there. A fellow named Dick Balsley, who was a former DPG Proving Grounds employee, said that in many cases where you see like a high berm or a test track with a banked corner, underneath that is a lot of metal that they used as fill. So again, as those regions are stripped down and made flat to become residential, home developments, there's no doubt that those bucket operator and bulldozer operators are going to find some pretty cool stuff tucked away. I just hope they know enough to not trash that stuff, because there's a lot of prototype and factory experimental stuff in those piles of dirt. And undoubtedly, some of the 1983 Corvettes are in there too. Well, that's another interesting fact. I'm going to take a break for just a couple of seconds here for a quick word from our sponsor. Okay, we're back. Quick little break there. Let's get right down to it. And this is from Chapter 1 of Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts. This is the Chevrolet chapter, sub-chapter Legend and Lore, number 10. In the dark days of the late 1970s, Corvette product planners weren't so sure the V8 engine would last much longer. Looking to maintain Corvette's image as a world-class performance car, a twin-engine platform was considered. The idea was to combine economical cruising with a small displacement V6 driving the front wheels. When maximum power was needed, a second engine instantly kicked in to drive the rear wheels. An operational test bed was constructed using a Citation X11 host vehicle. Powered by twin HO660 V6 engines tuned for 200 horsepower each, the push-me-pull-me Citation was extensively tested in public and private settings. Project Chief Engineer Richard Balsley admits to publicly humiliating a Porsche 911 turbo driver during a lunchtime outing on Woodward Avenue. Fortunately, V8 development flourished, taking the twin-engine Corvette concept to a dead end. The push-me-pull-me Citation was sold as part of the GM Heritage Collection and exists today in a private collection in Florida. It's true. Back in about 1998, I was assigned to go to Chevrolet Warren, Michigan Tech Center, where I was shown what we called Beyond the Toy Box. Now, before, I went to Chevrolet's Milford, Michigan engineering building and actually saw a lot of these pre-production prototypes and development cars like this twin-engine Citation. And you have to remember, back around 1979, 80, 81, the federal government had the CAFE, Corporate Average Fuel Economy standards, which they inflicted on Detroit. In other words, by 1980, every car made by General Motors had to be added up, its fuel economy, and divided by that number. And it had to be, I think, 19 mpg, which is a pretty high number at that time. If they didn't make 19 mpg, they were fined heavily. So, again, crazy ideas like, hey, let's put 2 small V6s in the Corvette and call it an economical performance car. Those ideas seemed sane. So again, I saw this car, and what they had basically was a Chevy Citation X11, which was kind of the Z28 Camaro of the Citation line. And I just remember the Citation was one of Chevrolet's first front-wheel drive mass-produced cars. Not a bad car, not a great car. It was the right car at the time. But they had 2 of these HO660 V6s, one up front, one in the back. And I remember looking inside, and they had twin ignition switches, twin tachometers, twin oil pressure gauges. Everything for each engine had 2 gauges for the front and the back. And it's funny because years and years later, somewhere around, I think 2012, 2013, I found that car again at the Barrett-Jackson, West Palm Beach collector car auction, and there it was for sale. And that thing runs. In fact, if you Google twin engine Citation, not the airplane, the Chevrolet, you'll actually see a video that the buyer of that car made. It's down in Florida, and it actually runs and drives. But yeah, Chevrolet was considering building twin engine Corvettes. And one thing too, you got to keep in mind, they used the Citation body so that it would throw people off. They didn't want people to know they were thinking about a twin engine Corvette. But Chevrolet was never thinking about twin-engine Citations. It was all about a future Corvette platform that never came to be. Number 11. The words Chevy and Hemi are never used in the same sentence, at least not when you're discussing showroom-available production cars. But it's a fact that Chevrolet was deeply involved in the study of such exotic features as hemispherical combustion chambers, multiple intake and exhaust valves, and overhead camshaft placement for possible use on production engines. A glint of light was shed on several experimental Hemi-head, big and small block engines in the December 1967 issue of Hot Rod magazine in a cover story called Chevy's Mustache Curlers. The pick of the litter was a single overhead cam 427 big block with gear-driven camshafts instead of the lengthy chains used by Ford's single overhead cam engine. Can you imagine the sensation caused by a new 68 Camaro SS 427 Hemi? Oh, what could have been. Yeah, it's a fact. I mentioned this earlier a couple of minutes ago, but yeah, Chevrolet pulled its own plug in 1963. And again, it was all about antitrust legislation brought by certain politicians who said, hey, General Motors, man, you're too big. We want to break you up. And it was a very real thing. So inside at General Motors, the managers of each division were told, look, you guys, no matter what you do, maintain a low profile. And what's higher profile than racing? Get rid of the race programs. Over and out. So as I mentioned a minute ago, the full-size Impala Z11, the Super Duty 421 Pontiac stuff, the Tempest 421s, and of course the Chevrolet Grand Sport Camaro Lightweight, all those programs were scrapped. No more. Now, they still work behind the scenes, on aluminum Hemis and aluminum blocks. And for a company that was out of racing, Chevrolet was very successful throughout the 1960s. But keep in mind, the 427 single overhead cam Ford Camera motor of 1965 and 6, and of course Chrysler's 426 race and street Hemis, they were radical engines. But Chevrolet was right there getting ready to drop the nuclear bomb on those 2 engines. Man, it could have been amazing. But again, the pushrod 427s were pretty potent and pretty much held their own with either the Camry or the Hemi when tuned properly, and especially when supercharged, they were very much even. So a lot of those funny cars, by 1967 or so, those door slammers with an injected Hemi or blown Hemi with fuel, you were totally able to keep up with a race Hemi or a Ford Camry. But without the supercharger, well, the Hemi heads of the Ford and the Mopar had a slight advantage. But man, it could have been crazy. And yeah, that issue of Hot Rod tells the tale. December of 67. About to find one on eBay. You'll see what I'm talking about. Moving on to number 12. Several years before the arrival of the 1966 giant killer L79 Nova, enthusiast magazines such as Hot Rod, Car Life, and Motor Trend ran articles featuring a new V8-powered Chevy 2. 2 wild examples were a 1962 four-door with a 340 horsepower 327 small block and a 4-speed manual that appeared in the March 62 issue of Motor Trend, and an even crazier 360 horsepower Rochester fuel-injected 2-door that showed up in the June 62 issue of Car Life. So were these lightweight bombs a well-kept order-form secret? Not quite. Though a mild 283 two-barrel engine was added to the Chevy 2 option list in 1964, RPO L32, any prior V8 installation was strictly done with an over-the-counter dealer kit. 2 kits were sold, part number 3790719, used a single exhaust system and included a 283 engine. Part number 3791361 included free-flowing dual exhaust supporting a 327 cubic inch engine of various power ratings. It's not known how many V8 conversion kits were sold, but an underlying motive was to demonstrate quasi-factory availability of V8 Novas so they'd be eligible for NHRA factory experimental use. One outstanding example was the ugly duckling, Rochester fuel-injected 327 Chevy 2 station wagon of Dyno Don Nicholson, winner of B Factory Experimental Honors at the 1962 NHRA Winter Nationals with a 12:55 108 mile-an-hour pass. So it's true, a lot of folks point out the 1967 and 66 and 67 L79 Novas, which had 350 horsepower, a little 327 4-barrel, and a 4-speed. And they say, man, those are hot rod Chevy V8s. But before that, Chevrolet actually tried to sell over-the-counter V8 conversion kits for Chevy Nova owners. So kind of a weird way to go about it. And again, keep in mind, 1963, Chevy had that anti-performance thing going on, so they really couldn't build crazy combinations. But it is true, if you want to get a kick, find some vintage pictures of Don Nicholson's ugly duckling Chevy 2 Nova wagon with a Rochester Corvette 327 under the hood. Crazy stuff. And up front, it still has the 4-lug wheels from its 6-cylinder origins. And at the back, you can see the 5-lug wheels of the Corvette rear actually swapped in underneath it to get the positive traction and the bigger bearings and axle shafts. Yeah, so, and again, Don Nicholson, we usually think of him as a Ford drag racer. Well, early on in 61, 2, and 3, he was all about Chevy 409s and little wagons like this here. By 64, Nicholson moved on to Mercury and became the legend for Ford from thereafter. Okay, fact number 13. This one's about Camaros. Second generation Z28 sales took a while to gain momentum. The outgoing 1969 Z28 sold more than 20,000 units. So when the 1970 Z, all new, totally redesigned, only accounted for 8,733 customers, all eyes were on 1971 sales performance. Unfortunately, 1971 saw 4,862 Z28s with even fewer 2,575 moving in 1972. But things improved dramatically in 1973 with 11,574 Z28 sales before growing even larger in 1974 to 13,802. Clearly, the Z28 was gaining momentum, so why did Chevrolet drop it in 1975 and 76? Truth is, General Motors came very close to canceling all F-body models, Camaro and Firebird, in 1974, sensing they were outdated in the new world of heightened fuel economy and emissions concerns. Fortunately, the Reaper was rebuked, and as Pontiac clearly demonstrated by selling nearly 75,000 Firebird Trans Ams during the Z28's hiatus, consumers still wanted performance cars. Chevrolet restored the Z28 in mid-year 77 and sold a respectable 14,349 units. Well, that's it for this first pilot episode of Steve Magg's Muscle Car School. Just like Jerry Seinfeld's Friends? What was it, Friends? No, that wasn't Friends. Seinfeld, there you go. Which was a show about nothing, right, early on, but became a show about everything, a brilliant show. We will be back. And if you want to throw a question at me and just try to stump me, go to stevemags.com, click on the mailbag, and throw me your most bizarre technical question. I'll read it right here in the air, and go ahead and try and stump me. I'm good.